Now I have a particular pleasure in presenting the award of our Diplomacy Award to our guest of honor and introducing Ambassador Robert Zoellick. Obviously, I could spend the rest of our allotted time on the introduction. I looked at what he has done. I thought, what has he not done? Chairman of Goldman Sachs, Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard, member of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, President of the World Bank Group, U.S. Trade Representative, former Deputy Secretary right here in this building, at the White House, lead U.S. negotiator for the 2+4 process for Germany. But I've never heard an introduction that drew as much attention as the actual presentation. And so I thought I would stop there. So with that, Ambassador Zoellick, can I ask you to come up and let me present to you, first of all, let me just read to you the citation on the Walter and Leonore Annenberg Award for Excellence in Diplomacy for 2016, awarded to Robert B. Zoellick, a diplomat, economist, and negotiator. As Undersecretary of State, he played a leading role in the negotiations for the unification of Germany and later served as Deputy Secretary of State. As U.S. Trade Representative, he helped bring China and Taiwan into the WTO and revived U.S. trade policies. As President of the World Bank, he increased the bank's capital while broadening its lending to the poorest and confronting the challenge of framing as part of the search for an inclusive and sustainable globalization. In recognition of this lifetime of achievement, the American Academy of Diplomacy is proud to present the 2016 Walter and Leonore Annenberg Award for Excellence in Diplomacy to the Honorable Robert B. Zoellick. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Ron, for the kind introduction and the honor of receiving the award. Thank the always eminent Tom Pickering, who first contacted me about this and from whom I've learned a great deal. My good friend Tom Shannon, who I had the opportunity to work with in many capacities. I see many, many friends and former colleagues here, too many to name. But for those of you that were in the Foreign Service, I'll share with you a little story that just came to my attention this week, which I hope will give you a good, warm feeling about your service. And that is, I was asked by a Chinese-American woman from Hawaii, who I met through working on a task force with the Council on Foreign Relations, to write some letters of recommendation for graduate school, which is how I spend much of my time now, writing letters. Or the other chance, by the way, that many of you didn't have is if you work at the World Bank, you also have to write many letters of recommendation for visas or for green cards. But this young woman, a very talented woman, has recently won the Rangel Fellowship because her aim is to become a Foreign Service officer. And she's an extraordinarily talented young woman, first generation American, and I think that she will be a wonderful person to follow in the footsteps of all of your careers. I also am really delighted to have a chance to meet Patricia Taylor, and I want to thank you and your late husband for your courageous action. I'm a very big believer in the North American relationship, so much so that I just came back about a week ago from Churchill, Manitoba, which is really far north, where my wife and I were looking at the polar bears. This, of course, is a very well-read audience, so probably they all know that this relationship really starts in 1817 with the Russ-Bagehot Agreement, which said no more militaries in terms of the Great Lakes. Although a historian at UVA reminded me, I think both sides kept one ship there. So it shows there's always a little wariness about the independence and sovereignty of both sides. But you are a personal example in your courage of what that relationship means, so thank you. So today's event and the American Academy of Diplomacy's recognition of my service is especially meaningful for me because in recent months I've been reflecting on the people and ideas that have shaped American diplomacy through the country's history. So I know there's a lot of attention to current events, but I'm going to take you back a little bit, and even further back than most of your careers. Presidential transitions, of course, always provoke speculation about the future course of U.S. diplomacy. And indeed, this election has prompted questions about whether the United States will remain committed to the international order that America created and sustained over the past 70 years. Some 20 years ago, probably like many of you, I first read Henry Kissinger's magisterial book, Diplomacy. And I enjoyed how Dr. Kissinger drew on history and the past to illuminate the art of diplomacy. Yet I've always sensed that Dr. Kissinger's perspective, however wide-ranging and insightful, was rooted in a European experience. Of course, Dr. Kissinger was one of the great practitioners of U.S. statecraft, and he cited examples from U.S. history to make his case. But his subtext is that America's experience with diplomacy reflected, as Bismarck allegedly observed, that God always looks after fools and the United States. In fact, I believe that the luck and innocence perceived by Europeans actually reflected diplomatic design and, well, some good fortune, too. America's tradition in diplomacy is rich with experience and ideas that I believe offer insights for today. So to illustrate my perspective, today I wanted to offer examples from three eras: the founding and early years of the United States, the opening decades of the 20th century, and the early Cold War. Three founding fathers, Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson, left storied legacies for American diplomacy. George Washington was the pathfinder for both the new American Republic and for American diplomacy. Washington was drawn to the frontier as a young surveyor, soldier, land speculator, and his westward orientation shaped the first president's perspective on the potential for a new and expanding American Republic. Washington's continentalist outlook provided the frame of reference for U.S. foreign policy for over a century. The United States would be an actor in the Atlantic world, but its strategic orientation would be toward what a European would have termed the marchlands or the borderlands. And U.S. foreign policy competed for these lands, whether with European, Latin American, or indigenous peoples. John Jay's unpopular treaty with Britain, a cornerstone of Washington's policy, secured a piece of peace and specific objectives in the West, which was the future source of power. Washington recognized, as many later revolutionaries did not, that his new government, a very experimental republic, needed a reprieve from revolution. This wise observation was the grounding for Washington's farewell address and his warning against permanent alliances that might reduce the republic's freedom for maneuver. Now, Alexander Hamilton complimented Washington by serving as the architect of American power. Hamilton was drawn to power: economic, military, political, and personal, and most importantly, to systems of national power. His early years in the Caribbean led him to recognize commercial power and the vast possibilities of meritocracy, mixing peoples and nationalities in a very new system. Hamilton's principal project was the creation of an integrated financial system that connected national debt, a national bank, customs information and a tax system, good credit, debt incentives, and incentives for commerce and investment. And this enterprise had both institutional and international implications. Hamilton's economic system enabled the United States to borrow abroad, to pay for an army and navy. It encouraged participation in international trade, and it signaled the emergence of a rising economic power. Hamilton was more eager than Washington to embrace the Atlantic world, which the president viewed realistically while trying to keep at arm's length. And in contrast with Jefferson and Madison, Hamilton's economic diplomacy reflected an admiration for British systems, which the Virginians feared would encourage the corruption of government powers, aristocracy, and perhaps even the imposition of a despised monarchy. Now, Jefferson, in turn, was the futurist of American diplomacy. Whereas Hamilton's vision was for arrangements of power, Jefferson had an eye for the potential of the human spirit. Consider the achievements that Jefferson chose to record on his tombstone: the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and the University of Virginia. Now, the greatest of Jefferson's visions for the future resulted in the Louisiana Purchase. The sweep of this foreign policy accomplishment was as wide-ranging as the territory. The purchase removed European powers from physical proximity to the United States, providing security. Western farmers gained sole access to the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans, the critical transportation route for their livelihoods. The American vision and power would be peopled by future generations that could move unimpaired across the continent. And Jefferson even sharpened the vision for the future with the scientific explorations of Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery. But Jefferson, the futurist, had a very pragmatic streak, too. He creatively abandoned his strict construction of the Constitution by interpreting the right to govern territory as justifying the right to acquire territory. Now, Jefferson's Empire of Liberty also depended on visionary legislation that he had proposed to Congress even before the Constitutional Convention. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 would treat the newly settled territories as potentially self-governing, co-equal states with the original founding 13. And just consider how that design offered a striking contrast with Russia's eastward expansion or Europe's colonies. Yet, some of Jefferson's visionary ideas failed. His embargo cost Americans dearly without stopping British or French depredations at sea. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, a response to Federalist threats to liberties, planted the seeds of ideas that later led to secession and civil war. And Jefferson could never overcome the evil of slavery. Now, two designers of American foreign policy in the succeeding generation, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, added complementary ideas to the founders' diplomacy. Adams and Clay defined an American realism. Now, Dr. Kissinger's very first book, A World Restored, relates the diplomatic reaction within Europe following the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars to radical nationalism, republicanism, and militant public passions. In contrast to the Holy Alliance that was the capstone of this restored 19th century European balance of power, Adams and Clay sought to design an American system. So Adams shrewdly acquired Florida from Spain, secured the western edge of the Louisiana Purchase and the renunciation of Spanish claims to the Northwest, and pushed Russia to cede its American claims south of 5440. Summarizing his strategic goal, Adams asserted that, quote, American continents are no longer subjects for any new European colonial establishment. And that, of course, is the logic that came to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. To achieve an American system in the Western Hemisphere, which would stand in contrast to Europe's Holy Alliance, the United States would support revolutionary governments in former Spanish provinces, but it would not fight for them. Adams knew that Britain's Royal Navy really was the enforcer of this doctrine, but Adams still refused to align with London's policy because he did not want the United States, quote, to come as a cockboat in the wake of a British man of war. According to Adams, the U.S. government would not, quote, go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. In response to calls for U.S. support for Greeks rebelling against Ottoman overlords, Adams replied with what has become the classic statement of American realism. The United States is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. Now, Henry Clay's American system was a domestic program to expand the national economic market. But as Adams' Secretary of State, Clay sought to extend that system through the hemisphere, offering a vision of the Americas that has shone, faded, and reappeared time and again over the centuries. For Clay, the new American republics would be a counterpoint to the Holy Alliance's dim assembly of mysticism, state religion, and reactionary politics. Clay's practical purpose were political, commercial, and defensive. Ultimately, tensions over slavery and differences with the new Latin republics doomed Clay's first try as a hemispheric planner. Yet Clay had planted seeds of ideas that have periodically blossomed in U.S. diplomacy: the New World versus the Old, a democratic hemisphere, opportunities for free trade and closer economic integration throughout the Americas. So by the end of the 19th century, U.S. foreign policy faced the strategic question of aims beyond the neighborhood of North America and the Americas. Trade, finance, and immigration had connected the United States to Europe and Asia throughout the country's first 125 years. U.S. missionaries, educators, engineers, soldiers of fortune had journeyed around the world, and they had become actors in networks that extended policy beyond the state-centered order. The experience abroad of dreamers and hustlers and practical men and women shaped U.S. public attitudes towards the wider world. Consider then the second era of American diplomacy. The opening of the 20th century set the stage for two giants, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, to redefine the U.S. perspective on global power and international orders. Roosevelt was the balancer of power. His foundation was military power, especially the big stick of the U.S. Navy, which he built to a size exceeded only by Britain's. Roosevelt secured the continental base of U.S. power through very aggressive negotiations with Britain over rights in the Caribbean and to claims for the Alaskan Panhandle. And then TR midwifed the creation of an independent Panama, where he engineered what he considered to be his greatest achievement, a canal that would link the Atlantic and Pacific. In East Asia, after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, Roosevelt mediated a peace that reestablished a balance while preserving the open door of commercial access to China. The Root-Takahara Agreement of 1908 codified a status quo with the rising power of Japan in the Pacific while supporting the independence and integrity of China. In Europe, Roosevelt sought a balance without domination by any power. As the Kaiser threatened to overrun Europe in World War I, Roosevelt wanted to join the Allies. He was also a supporter of a League of Nations, but one based on principles of power that differed from Woodrow Wilson's model. Now, Wilson was one of the first American scholars of political science, a new study that sought to categorize, analyze, and reform political systems. At home, Wilson tried to remake the federal government along parliamentary lines. But Wilson, the internationalist, sought to create an analogous model of reform for world affairs. He was the political scientist abroad. Wilson's initial resistance to involve the United States in World War I reflected both his experience in growing up in a devastated South after the Civil War, as well as his belief that Europe's conflagration was a predictable punishment for the old militarized European political order. When Wilson's efforts to maintain neutrality failed, he reached for war aims that differed from those of the past. Peace without victory, a world safe for democracy, and then his 14 points of January 1918. The United States did enter the war, but not as an ally, as an associated power, to avoid alliance commitments and preserve a freedom of diplomatic action. Now, the League of Nations emerged as Wilson's central idea for breaking with old-style European politics. Wilson became the first sitting president to leave the United States to negotiate the peace himself, an early example, which all of you are now familiar, of presidential personal diplomacy. But Wilson ignored the Senate, and he ultimately rejected reservations to the Versailles Treaty that probably would have given him his league while retaining congressional prerogatives over issues of war and peace. Now, as Kissinger explains in Diplomacy, Wilson's stroke and political failure led to later interpretations that Wilson's internationalism was martyred by America's isolationism. Yet I think history suggests otherwise. Charles Evans Hughes and Cordell Hull each represent a very important dimension of America's internationalism in the interwar period, and the themes that they have embodied have persisted. After the U.S. rejection of the Versailles Treaty in 1920, Secretary of State Hughes launched a dramatic effort during the 1920s to reduce and limit naval armaments. So Hughes, the arms negotiator, really called for an even bolder world order than the one that had been negotiated in Paris. Of course, battleships were the strategic weapons of the 1920s, like ICBMs and bombers of later eras. So for Hughes, naval arms control was an outgrowth of both strategic and budgetary logic. With the German fleet being scuttled, the Anglo-Americans dominated the Atlantic. So Hughes' plans for the Pacific was to use naval arms control to secure an Anglo-American advantage while supplanting pre-World War I imperial competition and the Anglo-Japanese alliance. The 9 treaties he negotiated, all ratified by the U.S. Senate, that arose from the Washington conferences, sought to animate the open door policy for China and end great power maneuvering to try to dominate China. But Hughes's initiative also recognized post-war economic and political shifts in Britain and Japan, as well as pressures in the U.S. Congress to cut military spending. Taken as a whole, the treaties partially reversed the failures at Versailles and added a very valuable focus on the Asia-Pacific. Yet Hughes was taking a strategic risk. Neither the United States nor the Royal Navy had enough capital ships to dominate both the Atlantic and Pacific simultaneously. Follow-up conferences had difficulty limiting cruisers and destroyers. And the innovative ships that commanded the later Pacific War, aircraft carriers and submarines, were not included. The liberal internationalists in Japan lost power. China's internal conflicts created openings for Japan's aggression. So here, Hughes' experience suggests some lessons for arms control. Unless arms control measures are connected to power relations and ongoing assessments of risk to security, limitations on weapons may not secure peace. And arms control efforts need to recognize technological innovations in warfare too. And insufficient spending on defense has left militaries unprepared regardless of agreements. Deterrence and resilience shape assessments of risk as much or more than treaties. Now, Cordell Hull of Tennessee, the free trader, was also an important diplomatic innovator between the world wars. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930 was the apotheosis of protectionism. It was the culmination of over a century of tariff acts through which Congress would list specific taxes on thousands of individual items. So Hull embodied the perspective of those commodity exporters who favored reducing trade barriers abroad while also lowering taxes on imports. Hughes's thinking was in line with the Wilsonian internationalist, who argued that favoring merchants over monarchs would encourage nations to value peace over war. Yet, unlike Wilson, Hull was very adept in creating a system that would become the engine of a free trade plan. The Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, Hull's legacy, delegated the president the authority to bargain lower tariffs within certain bounds. And over the next 10 years, Hull negotiated 32 agreements with 27 countries, chipping away substantially at Smoot-Hawley's high tariffs. Moreover, Hull's agreements incorporated the most favored nation, MFN principle, which meant that if one of the parties agreed to lower a tariff for another country, all the MFN parties would get the same benefit. Now, Hull wanted Congress to grant the executive branch this bargaining authority without time limit. And if you think of the many changes in the New Deal, Congress gave the executive a great deal of power, but it limited in this area. Congress dictated the term subject to renewal. And over the next 80 years, Congress would grant analogous trade negotiating authorities in various forms. After World War II, Under Secretary of State Will Clayton united the Marshall Plan with both European economic integration and negotiations on how to lower global trade barriers to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. Japan's recovery after World War II certainly depended on its exports, at first principally to the United States. And South Korea and other East Asians followed the same path. So trade negotiations and the pursuit of free trade have always been politically difficult because trade agreements seek a conjunction between the international and the domestic interests. Starting in 1985, the United States turned to bilateral free trade agreements and then regional free trade agreements, in addition to global trade negotiations. FTAs reflected both economic and foreign policy interests with foreign countries. FTAs would remove traditional barriers to trade, but also permitted the United States to create and expand new international rules for sectors of increasing importance. The deeper integration of free trade agreements enabled private sector actors to leverage U.S. strengths and innovation with transnational partners. FTAs helped developing economies to make internal reforms and adopt rule of law systems. The active FTA agenda created a competition and liberalization that added to U.S. influence and enhanced the attractiveness of the U.S. market as a magnet. The emerging networks of U.S. free trade agreements even provided an underpinning for economic, business, and person-to-person interests that supported security cooperation and alliances. Nevertheless, despite these advantages, today's free trade agreements face an uncertain and perhaps bleak political future. I'll now turn to the third era of American diplomacy, the early Cold War, when the shaping of U.S. policy and world order fell to George Marshall, Harry Truman, Dean Acheson, and Dwight Eisenhower. Marshall was the organizer of American post-war diplomatic effort. As Chief of Staff of the Army, Marshall had overseen the creation of a citizen army and the U.S. military victory. After President Truman asked Marshall to lead the State Department in 1946, the general deployed his executive skills to build today's modern organization from a sideline gentlemen's club that had become under FDR. Marshall created an important policy planning staff. He relied on talented subordinates such as Clayton and Acheson in key roles, and he used his high standing with Congress to restructure U.S. foreign policy. Now, of course, the Secretary of State's signal achievement was the Marshall Plan. And the strategic assumptions underpinning this plan have served as the cornerstone of U.S. relations with Europe for at least the next 40 years. In contrast with America's past, the United States assumed a leadership role in Europe while recognizing the need for European political ownership and economic integration. The economic integration and recovery of Europe required the participation of a new Federal Republic of Germany. Marshall maneuvered the Soviets to exclude themselves from his plan, inevitably creating a showdown over the future of Berlin and Germany. Through all this effort, Marshall recognized the need to keep congressional support and build the commitment of the U.S. public. Truman and Acheson, the founders of alliances, launched a revolutionary shift in U.S. diplomacy as bold as Marshall's. From Washington and Jefferson through Wilson, Americans had been schooled to avoid alliances, which the United States associated with Europe's old diplomacy of wars and domination. Truman and Acheson's new approach persisted over 40 years of Cold War, and now for 25 years since its end. U.S. alliances has depended on the backing of a sizable standing military, posted around the globe, and a reliable nuclear deterrent. As FDR's hope for post-war cooperation was stymied by implacable Soviets, Truman and Acheson changed strategies. The Truman Doctrine committed the United States to support Greece and Turkey, and Truman's language warned of a larger struggle for freedom. The Marshall Plan established the precedence of Western Europe over cooperation with the Soviets. West Germany assumed a critical place in both Europe's economy and its security, and German rearmament could only take place within an alliance led by the United States. NATO moved the frontier of U.S. and Canadian security to the heart of Central Europe. Berlin assumed a symbolic role of the U.S. commitment to the Germans and of Germany's alignment with the West. Now, U.S. diplomacy forged a different alliance structure across the Pacific, spokes of a wheel pointing to a U.S. hub. But ironically, the Asia-Pacific, a naval theater, became the battleground for two land wars that tested the U.S. Army. Across both the Atlantic and Pacific, the sustainability of U.S. alliances over decades required calculations of U.S. economic interest and the management of disputes. U.S. diplomacy had to address conflicts with Europe over dollar policy, trade, sharing of defense burdens. Export-led growth in East Asia contributed to wrenching adjustments in the U.S. economy. Over time, the successors of Truman, Marshall, and Acheson added security commitments, if not formal alliances, in the Middle East. Israel's security, energy security, commitments to the Gulf states, plus fears of nuclear proliferation led to new types of partnerships, wars, and U.S. diplomacy in search of peace and stability. Now, Dwight Eisenhower's diplomacy was really the bookend for this mid-20th century burst of creative and expansive American diplomacy. Eisenhower, the prudent executive, viewed his vital mission as calming the fever pitch of the early Cold War so as to try to prepare Americans for a long-term challenge. Eisenhower's model for the presidency was George Washington. Just as Washington had laid the foundation for a new constitutional republic, Ike would institute policy principles and processes to try to guide U.S. foreign policy in a new international order. Now, these creators of American internationalism after World War II were the forerunners of George H.W. Bush. By background, outlook, temperament, and personal style, Bush was unusually suited to lead the NATO alliance at the end of the Cold War and then to forge an unprecedented coalition to reverse Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Bush recognized the opportunity to work with Soviet leader Gorbachev in 1989. But first Bush, like Marshall, Acheson, Eisenhower, eventually JFK, and Reagan, started by shoring up the alliance with Europe. Bush's proposal in May of 1989 to slash and equalize conventional forces in Europe shifted the negotiating priority from nuclear weapons to the core issue, the one that had divided Europe since 1945. Bush's diplomatic offensive responded to Gorbachev's challenge. It prodded Soviet forces to leave Central and Eastern Europe, and it met the political needs of Germany, America's key ally on the Central Front. By the end of 1989, Bush and Chancellor Kohl of Germany backed Germany's unification within NATO, and the United States was one country that kept past faith with its German ally when others in Europe faltered. Yet Bush was also looking ahead to a stable outcome that could reassure Western and Eastern Europe, maybe even the USSR. Furthermore, the U.S. partnership with Germany recognized that a united Germany's future importance would be strong for both Europe and the transatlantic relationship. In 1990, Bush and Secretary of State Baker faced the challenges of creating a historic coalition, including the Soviet Union and Arab states, to reverse Iraq's occupation of Kuwait. Bush established limited objectives with an eye towards a future regional order. The United States built support and added legitimacy by working through the UN Security Council. Coalition partners even paid for the war. After liberating Kuwait, Baker capitalized on success by launching direct peace negotiations between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Bush also recognized that NAFTA, Ambassador Hills, could be the foundation for a new and deeper North American integration and partnership in a post-Cold War world. Similarly, Baker helped initiate APEC in 1989 to create a framework for a new Trans-Pacific economic order that would complement the U.S. regional security alliances. Now, over the past 25 years, the United States has been struggling to determine America's place in the changing world order and the aims of U.S. diplomacy. I think the U.S. diplomatic heritage offers some guidance. One theme is the importance of the home continent. Geography still matters. North America has unrealized potential, both for a stronger partnership among three democracies with 500 million people, energy self-sufficiency, and a continental base from which to extend power and values globally. Throughout the American experience, debates over alliances have framed questions of how the United States should relate to other countries, especially on issues of security. Over the course of 40 years after World War II, the United States devised and adjusted and persisted with the Atlantic and Pacific alliances, as well as special security ties in the Mideast. After the end of the Cold War, the United States continued this system, but now under different premises: democratic enlargement, primacy, stability, deterrence. And the United States has experienced successes, setbacks, tragedies, and today, public uncertainty. Sometimes it seems as if the stability and security of the 70-year-old order have been taken for granted in the United States and elsewhere. Beginning with Alexander Hamilton, the United States has incorporated political economy into diplomacy, dealing with issues of finance and credit and money and trade and development. The diplomacy of political economy is closely linked to America's private sector initiative. Economic dynamism at home fuels economic diplomacy. The economic connectivity of the world is likely to continue, and the United States will have to decide whether it will lead in shaping future arrangements. The United States experience in the Americas has been characterized by visions and realities, advances and setbacks. Slowly, the politics of the Western Hemispheric political outlook have been shifting from a North-South perspective to one that is East-West, focusing on how the hemisphere can adapt to and perhaps shape global economics, politics, and security. Events in Brazil and Argentina may offer new opportunities for partnerships with the Pacific Alliance of Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, in concert with the United States and Canada. Now, America's diplomacy is also dependent on military power and defense diplomacy. Today's military power reflects the current alliance system and the expeditionary requirements of that alliance. New technologies and new dangers will require continual adaptation, including in relations with other countries. The American experience has demonstrated the U.S. military can be a powerful, even an overwhelming tool, but it can't solve all problems. U.S. success at combining military means with political ends has been mixed, and lessons on ending wars have had to be continually relearned. The United States believed it could move beyond the old diplomacy of the 18th and 19th century Europe, and to a degree it has. Over the course of some 240 years, diplomacy has sought a higher purpose. The American experiment became American exceptionalism, yet Americans are students of power too. Ultimately, the traditions and themes of American diplomacy have been woven together with a vital strand: pragmatism. Ben Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay struck a very opportunistic deal to secure independence. Washington accumulated power to give the United States time to take root. Jefferson interpreted the Constitution so he could complete the Louisiana Purchase. Lincoln fought one war at a time, avoiding intervention by Britain and France. FDR cautiously mobilized public support for a global war after the Great Depression. Eisenhower prudently looked to the long haul. JFK learned to deal pragmatically in crisis. Ronald Reagan set very ambitious goals, yet was willing to negotiate and accept step-by-step results. And George H.W. Bush combined bold moves with careful restraint and constant diplomatic outreach. So over 240 years, the results of U.S. diplomacy stand up pretty well compared to others. So as we look to the years ahead and assess the foreign policy of the next administration, consider the core elements that stand out from these shadows of the past. Relations with our North American partners, which are our potential partners in shaping the future global order. The nature, reliability, and shared responsibility of U.S. alliances. Healthy international economic linkages, development of economic rules and opportunities for private actors to move around the world. Opportunities and risks in the Western Hemisphere. The realistic and measured use of military power and defense diplomacy, and the nature of American exceptionalism, which will always change to fit the challenges of the era. So the charge for the future is to find new pragmatic approaches, enriched by the experience, recognition, and antecedents of American diplomacy. Thank you.